Welcome, welcome. So happy to see all of you out there waiting on us. On behalf of the Bill of Rights Institute, we want to welcome you to our APUS Skills Prep. This is our fourth installation. We're amazing. We are having a good time doing this, and we're so happy to see some of you returning, hopefully some new ones showing up. My name is Nicole Moretti, and I am a professional development instructor for the Bill of Rights Institute. I also have been teaching for 31 years in the great state of Wyoming, and yeah, that's a long time. We would like you guys to go ahead and post any questions right at the first here of anything that we've covered so far that you have for Daniel to kind of maybe revisit if you've got questions. And then we'll get in tonight's subject is map analysis and contextualization. So let's welcome Mr. Daniel Jocz, a 2016 California Teacher of the Year and finalist for Teacher of the Year for the great nation. And he has been giving us some fantastic reviews and then gets you into some skills to use that information on the test. So I'm going to turn things over to him and let's keep the chat going.
All right, everyone. Good evening or good afternoon, wherever you might be. So how's everyone doing? Any questions in the chat? You know, how you feeling? You feeling a 5 or a 4 for your APUS journey? Which one is it? Like, we're getting into Harvard, Yale, or both, and then we have to reject one of them and just be like, you know what? It's not you, it's me. So I'll wait a second for the questions. We have a website and a YouTube channel. If you find yourself not knowing as much as you would like, there's tons of resources there. And I just want to tell you kind of where I got the inspiration for tonight's session. For you young whippersnappers, I feel like that's something that like a person of my age should maybe start saying. For you young whippersnappers, back in the day, there was like these things called Thomas guides. And when I would drive somewhere, I'd have to like break open this book and like track my route. I didn't have any smartphones or Waze or things like that. And I just always have been really into maps. And so maps can tell us a lot. Maps appear on the DBQ. They appear on the multiple choice section. And if you think about it, you can actually review the entire history of the United States with some really good maps and spark a lot of really interesting conversation. So today I decided, you know what? I'm going with the maps because I think that it's a good refresher. And a lot of us are visual people. We like to see this stuff. So we're going to practice contextualization, and then sprinkled throughout today's presentation, there's going to be some kind of examples of how you may see maps on the actual exam. So hopefully we'll get a good review in. We'll work on some contextualization skills, like what's going on during this moment. And then we'll also practice a couple different sections of the APUS exam, SAQ in particular, but also some DBQ, LAQ stuff. Yeah, street guides, crazy. Like you get lost, you'd have to literally pull over or drive with your legs, which is really dangerous. Don't do that. But yeah, I'm all about the maps. So I want to start with this first one, which actually was the real inspiration after I started just seeing maps. And there's a lot of bogus maps on the internet, like people try to send to go viral. But this one was really cool. And it's as of 2014. And one thing you probably learned a whole bunch of stuff about, I don't know where you are, but if you're in sunny Los Angeles in the great state of California, if you don't know, the most common language spoken other than Spanish or English. So Spanish would be the second most common language after English in most states, not all. But if you look at what would be the most common language, it's actually Tagalog in California. Whereas if you go to nearby states such as Arizona, the Navajo language is in New Mexico and Arizona, the most common language after English or Spanish. Now think about that for a moment. We've been learning about the history of immigration. And one of the things that you may kind of remember is there's been phases of immigration. And you could see one of those phases. Look who is the third most common language in a whole bunch of states. It is the Germans. You also can see the history of this country in looking at Louisiana. Remember New Orleans, founded by the French. You know, obviously the indigenous people were there, where you had the French. The one that blew me away, and I just don't know enough about Texas, is the third most common language in Texas is Vietnamese. So I was like, okay. And so you could tell the history of this country by oftentimes looking at the names of places on a map, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. So let's kind of get started. And like I said, I have a whole bunch of maps, and then I'm going to kind of, in the chat, ask you to think about what kinds of information does this stimulate in your brain, as well as some practice skills right here. First, I want to start with geography. I don't know about you, but when I was 16, 17 years old, my sense of geography, I grew up in Los Angeles, was super. I remember driving to Vegas, and that was like, oh my God, we're driving forever, because we'd be on the car for 5.5 to 6 hours. And then as a more grown-up person, I drove and I kept going up the coast of California. And a whole lot of hours later, we were still in California. So this country is huge. It's diverse, not just racially, religiously, but also geographically. So depending upon where you are, you probably have your own unique kind of geography. And that leads me to my first point about maps and review, and that is this. The other thing I did is, since we kind of talked about the key concepts yesterday, is I found the key concept that best or closely connects to the maps I'm showing you. So hopefully to review some of the things. So for example, and what I'd like you to do in the chat is to actually tell me anything you know that connects to the key concept or connects to the map you're seeing. So this particular map really fascinates me, because one of the things you're supposed to know is different native societies adapted to and transform their environments through innovations in agriculture, resource, and social structure. So if you take a look, these are just some of the indigenous communities, as well as some of the economic activities. So if you look up in this particular region, there was a lot more agriculture taking place, which means the populations were much more dense. So this is pre-contact, before Columbus got himself lost. And so in the chat, as we're going, if you would just kind of like, what are things you remember that stimulate this kind of discussion, like give context to this particular map. So what was going on in these different parts of these geographic regions? You have a hunter and gathering society in certain parts. You have a much more nomadic society amongst the native communities of the Great Plains. And, a lot of this was just based upon geography. If you were in an area where it wasn't very fertile, you couldn't support big, huge populations. As a result, the communities, Kate mentioning the bisons in the Great Plains, they very much kind of were dependent upon and utilized the resources they had available. And so these are things that you need to keep in mind is, how did different tribes, you don't need to know them all, but could you identify some examples that native people pre-contact participated in? Whereas if you go up into the kind of Seattle, Vancouver area, you will get much more of a fishing, use of the sea is a much bigger part of that idea, right? Talking about fertile soil in the southern areas. Yeah, it's very fertile here, especially along the coast. And guess what's going to happen? The British colonists, they're going to arrive, the French colonists, the Spanish colonists, they're going to come into contact with different tribes at different moments. Yeah, pueblos and irrigation, lots of different things going on here. The Navajo, the Hopi. Here's another one. And this one's kind of similar, but it kind of extends that idea, right? There's all these different kind of climates. And once again, there is adaptations being made. There's this kind of misperception, usually amongst the younger kids, that when you say Native American or indigenous people, it's this monolithic group, and it's not. They spoke different languages, had social hierarchies, different economies. All of this is before Columbus. And one thing you need to be able to do is identify places and kind of give some examples. I think the Bison and the Pueblo people are two great kind of, or the Great Plains you see in the darker brown in the Great Basin. Those are great examples that you could kind of use, or the Pueblo people up into the American Southwest. Another one that you should keep in mind is the Columbian Exchange brought new crops to Europe from the Americas, as well as new resources, vegetables, disease, and that Columbian Exchange is going to forever alter the kind of life of all of these different regions. And so what are some things you know about the Columbian Exchange and how it stimulated population growth? You know, when it came to the European diet, when you think about, you know, some people celebrate the holiday of St. Patrick's Day, right? And the Irish and all the kind of pageantry and things that go along with that. But when you think about the Irish in history, the potato, and the potato is actually indigenous to the Western Hemisphere. It is only introduced to Europe and Ireland and the rest of the continent after the fact. So all of these different things, wealth, disease, are kind of shifting these societies in different directions. And so think about just that as well. We're actually going to come back to this one because there's an SAQ we'll practice, but let's do a little bit more review here. Another big topic you should, and good point, Charles, it's significant destruction to the native population, especially with the introduction of disease like smallpox. That is going to be a game changer in terms of, while Europe is increasing population because of these new nutritious resources like potatoes, for the native people, there's going to be this dramatic drop off. Another big thing that you hopefully remember is European nations' efforts to explore and conquer the New World stem from a search for new sources of wealth. You know, many of these countries are sending out their explorers, whether it be Columbus, commissioned by Spain, or Cartier by France. They're looking for wealth, be it gold, silver, or things like sugar or other agricultural products, as well as economic and military competition and a desire to spread Christianity. So this particular map, you know, some of these I don't have dates on them, so it's hard to kind of think about context, but just what were some of the things that allowed for this process to unfold, where you have Dutch, English, French, Spanish colonization taking place, not just in North America, but throughout the Western Hemisphere. You know, so think about just kind of who gets there first. Spain is first, but they're also the first in North America, St. Augustine, Florida. You know, then you get Jamestown in 1607, then you get Quebec in 1608. So just how these different countries, God, glory, and gold. Yes, Eunice, that's kind of the 3 Gs. There were different motives. And, you know, one thing to keep in mind is different countries had different motives in different regions. You know, so when you think of Spain, you think of the missions, especially if you were in the 4th grade in California. For whatever reason, they make you make a popsicle stick mission diagram or model. But, you know, part of it was converting the native people to Catholicism, but there was also an economic, especially when you look at the empire in what is today Mexico or in Peru. So yeah, new technology as well. So that's the kind of thing I want to see you guys doing in the chat, is really, you know, what kinds of things come to mind, and that new technology allows this process to unfold. It also kind of ushers in that Columbian exchange. Another thing to keep in mind is European nations' efforts to explore and conquer the New World stem from a search for new sources. So this is the same one, but I wanted to show you how these empires begin to unfold. And what's interesting about maps is sometimes size isn't everything, boys and girls, when it looks at who's winning the colonization race. Because if you look at this map, it looks like France is just dominating North America and Spain's not doing too shabby themselves. But when it comes to the 13 colonies under Britain, not as much. But that's not necessarily the case. We'll see in just a few moments. So what were the motives of the British, the French, the Spanish? Why were there so few French colonists in North America in comparison to a place such as Haiti, for instance? So these are the types of things that you will be studying in periods 1 and 2 in APUSH. Another big idea to keep in mind is in the 17th century, early British colonies develop along the Atlantic coast. So of course it starts with Virginia in the Chesapeake, and then we get the New England colonies, the Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay Colony, and others follow, with regional differences that reflected various environmental, economic, cultural, and demographic factors. So I'm putting these key concepts in there because if you didn't attend yesterday's session, go ahead and watch that session about political parties. But one thing we noticed is oftentimes the key concepts reflect the answer choices that may be correct. So yeah, the French are, as Kate is mentioning, very much involved in the fur trade in the interior of the continent. The British are largely settling the East Coast. Don't forget, and a lot of people, including myself, we don't even cover this in class because of time, the British are also involved in the West Indies, in the Bahamas. In fact, that's where a lot of their resources went because that's where the money was being made up until Virginia and the kind of discovery of tobacco cultivation in terms of its profitability. A lot of the early British settlement are in places like Bermuda, Barbados, two wonderful places to visit on vacation if we ever can again after COVID. But these were British colonies that also had their own indigenous people as well. So what were the different reasons for the colonies? That's an important thing to keep in mind, okay? I'm digging how you're all kind of sharing things that you know from the chat, and you're inspiring me. I think you're gonna get 8+6s this year. I'm feeling it. This one's a key one because it's in the concepts as well. The French and Dutch colonial efforts involved relatively few Europeans and relied on trade alliances and intermarriage with American Indians to build economic and diplomatic relationships and acquires furs and other products for export to Europe. When you look at this map, early on, and this map is up until 1660. So this is really early in the game. But if we go back over here, and you can see this area that's claimed by France because they didn't have an ability to defend this area. We'll see in just a few moments. Neither did Spain really, in terms of when we talk about New Spain in what is today North America, there's not a lot of Spanish settlers. And the Dutch are in the area, what would be today New York, Manhattan in particular. Going back here, you could see the Dutch settlement, the Netherlands, you could see the British settlement, you could see the beginnings of the French settlement. And remember, if you ain't got a lot of people, you better be friends or at least friendly to the indigenous people that are there. Not to mention, many of the French and the Dutch were involved in the fur trade. And who knows how to find those furry things better than anybody else? Well, the people that had been hunting them and utilizing them as resources for generations. So the relationship between the French and the Dutch is much more complex. It doesn't mean that they were nice to them or that they were any less inclined to have racist sentiments towards the indigenous people, but there was a degree of intermarriage even, as well as trade alliances that were forming. That's not the case with our British colonies. The key concept says in the 17th century, early British colonies developed along the Atlantic coast with regional differences that reflected various environmental, it is cold as heck up here, economic, you can make tobacco, you can grow tobacco here, you can grow rice here, you can't grow it up here, and cultural and demographic factors. So who came to these colonies? This is a big thing that was a big part of this story. Who came and why they came dictates how the colonies develop early on. And hopefully you all remember, it's largely the Puritans who come into this region, whereas in the Virginia area, it's predominantly men looking for economic profits or to make some cash. Whereas in Maryland, it was initially a Catholic colony, and then quickly more Catholics, non-Catholics came than Catholics. The New York colony was originally part of the Dutch, and then, England rolls up on them. South Carolina, you get rice plantations. In Georgia was a penal colony that ultimately kind of gets abandoned. So there's a whole variety of things that happen during this development that makes these colonies unique. And you should know, what are the similarities, differences between the New England colonies, the middle colonies? Chesapeake always gets confusing to people. We're talking about Virginia and Maryland. That's kind of what those Chesapeake colonies, but oftentimes they'll be lumped in with the Southern colonies in general. Those regions, the southern colonies, had longer growing seasons, and they were able to kind of rely on cash crops, either tobacco or rice, or even indigo in some cases. Yes, and Malik's bringing up a really good point about the middle colonies being more of a mixture. They were a mixture in terms of their economics. They were a mixture also of who was there. Remember, it was the Quakers who came to Pennsylvania, but you had quickly other people coming, and William Penn invited and allowed for a wide degree of religious tolerance in that particular region. So the colonies of Pennsylvania and New York tended to be much more diverse than some of the other areas. And of course, the New England ones, as Charles points out, they were by far the most religious. But even that is not as simple as you might imagine. They come here for religious freedom, but remember what they do to anybody who has any religious ideas outside their established way of thinking. Shout out to Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson. They get booted. Oh, you can't question the way we're doing it in our colony. So keep that in mind as well. This is another question we can return to. This is a question that was on a DBQ that is released. This was actually one of the documents. In what ways did ideas and values held by Puritans influence the political, economic, and social development of the New England colonies from 1630 through the 1660s? So actually, we'll just take a moment just to drop some ideas in the chat. Like if you had this question and the only document you had was this map, what would you do with it? And remember, when you're looking at a document, whether it's a map, a journal entry, a political cartoon, it's not there for you to describe it. You're not going to like break down, well, in the map, it's a town map, and it's from colonial New England, and then proceed to count the houses. There are approximately 22 houses. Like there's a place for cows to eat. That's not what you're doing here. We don't need a description. How does this document, whatever it may be, in this case, map, how does it help you answer this question? Okay. So if you have some ideas, you could drop them in the chat, and I'll just kind of highlight a few things. Yeah, and Eunice, you're beating me to it, so thank you. The ideas of community, you could see this is a very structured place in terms of it looks tight knit, even just physically. There is a school which you can kind of talk about the value of education. Not necessarily so people can read, Harry Potter novels, but so that they could read the Bible. There is obviously church and the role of church and government, the town hall meeting. Remember, all adult male members of the church. And you can bring in outside information, right? You can bring in things that are not in this map. So you can acknowledge that the church was very important to the New England colonies. The town hall, all adult male members were able to make decisions. There was a sense of community. Remember, even before the colony was founded, they had a plan. John Winthrop said, we're going to create a city upon a hill. Religion and government are linked together. Thank you, Tatiana. There is all of these things would help you answer this question. So don't be surprised if you see a map on a DBQ or a stimulus-based multiple choice question. Your job, though, is not to explain the map. I can't tell you how often I've read things where people will literally, I don't know if it's just out of desperation, they'll just start describing what it is versus how does it help us answer this question, right? So good stuff in the chat in terms of your expectations about what to do with this particular document. This one's a really wordy one, but the other part of the story that you're supposed to be aware of is just as these colonies are forming, as they develop their own unique set of economic and social structures. A bunch of you mentioned that in the middle colonies, I believe I saw someone say breadbasket or mixed economy. Yeah, they're growing wheat, corn, they're growing rice and indigo, they're growing tobacco here. They're involved in shipbuilding up in the Massachusetts area. As they're doing this, an Atlantic economy developed in which goods are going back and forth between these different regions, including, sadly, enslaved people from Africa as well. So understand how these economies begin to develop and fundamentally change not just life in the New World, but also in Europe as well as in Africa. So, and remember, does anyone recall how these colonies were governed? Because England and France and Spain and the Netherlands, they have colonies to benefit, to enrich the mother country. They're not just doing this because they had a midlife crisis and they're trying to see the world. What's the economic principle which governs them? It's this idea of mercantilism, this idea that it's going to benefit and enrich the mother country. So oftentimes the raw materials would be sent to Europe, and in exchange, manufactured goods would come back to the colonies. This one, I love this map because everyone likes to talk about how diverse we are as a country, but very often they don't understand that diversity from its origins. You know, the presence of different European religious and ethnic groups. Think about that for a moment. We're not just talking about an ethnic diversity, we're talking about a religious diversity. You know, there were Quakers, there were Catholics, there were some Jews in the New York area. There were a variety of religious groups. There were people who didn't care about the religious stuff at all. But you also had ethnic groups, and there was a degree of pluralism. Know that word. A lot of people see that word on the thing, and they go, "Oh, wait, what's that word?" Right? This diversity and an intellectual exchange. And you're going to see kind of it enhanced by things like the Great Awakening and ideas from the Enlightenment that was coming over from Europe. So if you look at this map, you're going to see, you know, there's going to be a higher degree of German people going into Pennsylvania. You're going to have the Scots-Irish really going into the interior of the South. You're going to have, of course, the Dutch we've already mentioned. And then, of course, some colonies are going to have a majority African population from the start. South Carolina, there were more people of African descent, many of them enslaved, not all, who actually were living in South Carolina from the origins of this country during the colonial period. So a lot you could kind of see in terms of diversity. And I think back to the map I showed you in 2014 about just most common languages. Well, imagine kind of walking the streets of New York during this period of time. You'd hear all sorts of different languages in these colonies. This map, I think, is dramatic for a number of reasons as well. And if you ever travel, which once again, I'm a big traveler, that's kind of what I spend my money on. That's why I have holes in my socks right now versus getting new ones, is all of the British colonies participated in varying degrees in the Atlantic slave trade due to the abundance of land and a growing European demand for colonial goods, as well as shortage of indentured servants. The reason why I stick on this map is not just about the British colonies, it's about all the different colonies, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, and so on. What it shows you is the slave trade. And hopefully you're aware of that idea of the Middle Passage, the horrific journey that those who are captured and enslaved are forced to endure. But what is striking to me, anyone notice what this kind of map shows us in terms of where most of the enslaved people are going and kind of why I link it back to this idea of traveling? And that is the fact that overwhelmingly, by far, the people who are brought, the forced labor, the forced immigration, if you can even call it that, are being brought to places like Brazil, the Caribbean, places that if you go today, you will see a diversity that many people are not expecting. You know, you go to Brazil, there's people lighter than me and of all different shades. Brazil, because of its history of slavery. Cuba, the same thing. Haiti, a French colony. So you'll see the remnants of the institution of slavery. And so keep in mind, most slaves that are brought into the British colonies go to the West Indies because that was their moneymaker. But all 13 colonies had slavery within their societies at the start of the American Revolution. But you could see from just the size of the arrows where the majority of slaves were oftentimes brought, especially if you go into the Caribbean and places like I mentioned, Haiti, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and so on. So you could see that when you travel this rich diversity. Another important thing, and this one's extremely important, is 1763. There's a reason the College Board put 1763 as the start of the third period of the curriculum, and that is this. Take a look, the competition among the British, French, and American Indians. Don't forget that. Native people, the American Indians, are making decisions during this colonization. In some cases, they're forming alliances with the French. In some cases, they're forming alliances with even the British. And they're doing this for economic and political advantage in North America. And ultimately, there's going to be 4 major wars fought, both in Europe, but also in North America. The fourth one is the one you should really know about, which is, of course, the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as it's known over in Europe. Look what happens. And this map has actually been used on a couple of DBQs in the past. And oftentimes, once again, students will just describe the map. But beyond just describing the map, what do you see going on? What's the outcome here? Let's just say you don't really know the history. And the question is asking you, to what extent is 1763 a major turning point? And one significant thing you could quickly point out, even if you don't know this right off the top, is the removal of the French after the French and Indian War. They are kicked out. They lost the war. And with the stroke of a pen, the boundaries of North America are shifted, at least in the minds of the European leaders. It's important you also know why the American Indians, many of them sided with the French during this war. Not all, but many. And so this is part of that story that is the outcome of the British winning the French and Indian War, but it has repercussions. Not to mention, why 1763 is so important? Well, if you're England, now you got to defend all this stuff and you got to pay for it all. And you got Native Americans who are not too happy about losing their European partner, France. And so you have Pontiac's Rebellion. And Pontiac's Rebellion causes the British, you see this line right here, to say, you know what, we're going to issue a proclamation of 1763. You're not going to go west because we don't want to try to defend you and babysit and deal with that consequence. So a lot can be done with a map like this. And nonetheless, that's a big turning point. Skipping ahead to the American Revolution, you know, I was thinking to myself, like, you don't need to know all the battles of the American Revolution. There's a question in the chat. Treaty of Paris split territory between the Spanish and British. So yeah, a lot of, up into the Mississippi River, the Spanish were given the territory west of the Mississippi River. So you can kind of see Spain's claim to territory is right about here. And then once the French are removed, Spain will take this territory. Of course, Napoleon will get it back, which is why we end up buying it and, you know, all that stuff. But you don't have to worry about the battles of the American Revolution, but you should know. Notice what it says in the key concept, despite considerable loyalist opposition. And then it goes on to say kind of why the colonies end up winning. There was, in some places, extremely high number of colonists who supported the loyalists. In, for instance, New York, Wilmington, Charleston, and South Carolina, there were a lot of loyalists. And there's the old kind of like saying that like 1/3 of the colonists were patriots, 1/3 were loyalists, and 1/3 were neutral. Whatever army was close, they'd be like, yeah, let's go for those guys. But the presence of loyalists raised challenges for the colonies. How do you fight when you're not a united country? You're not even a country. You're a collection of 13 colonies with not a real shared sense of history. And you got people who want to stay loyal. Who was loyal? Well, people who were oftentimes political appointees, members of the Anglican Church, some people of the wealthy who wanted to preserve the status quo. So there were loyalists. And just a map like this, you can kind of talk about where the loyalists are, and more importantly, why someone would choose to be loyal to England at a time of the American Revolution. A couple more before we kind of get into another kind of example of how a document map could be used as a document. Here's America after the American Revolution, 1783. Have y'all figured out yet that there are way too many Treaty of Parises in American history? How many can you name? There's a prize if you get it right. There's no free shipping though for the prize. I'm going to mail you a paperclip. There's like so many Treaty of Parises. The French and Indian War, Treaty of Paris. The American Revolution, Treaty of Paris. There's a whole bunch more. I don't want to give them away though, but we've already got 2. The U.S. government forged diplomatic initiatives aimed at dealing with the continued presence of the British and Spanish. They want you to know that. Just look at this map. This is not a world where America is a big superpower. We are weak. We're barely a country. First under the Articles of Confederation, then they scrapped that and under the Constitution. And we got, neighbors next to us, Spain, who are hostile to the United States. Remember, Spain closes off the Mississippi River, and then it only opens up with Pinckney's Treaty. And then we had the British who had the forts, and they were giving the weapons to the Native Americans. And then eventually we're going to, throw down again with the War of 1812. So there's a lot of challenges facing the United States, including as settlers move beyond the Appalachian Mountains, as they cross this mountain range, you're coming into contact with the British, you're coming into contact with Native people. And if you get to the Mississippi River, you're coming into contact with Spain's claim to that area. So that's another thing to keep in mind. This is one of the few events that are actually explicitly mentioned in the key concepts. And when I say that, that means that you must know this in some detail, and that is the Northwest Ordinances. They say, as settlers moved westward during the 1780s, so as people are going west, Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, enacted the Northwest Ordinance for admitting new states. Okay, there's people here. How do we turn those bad boys into states? And what they did under the Northwest Ordinances is basically kind of develop the system. And you don't need to be an expert on the system. You don't need to know that it was 60,000 people per township and all that stuff. But just know that they set up the public education requirement. There was protections for private property. The states would enter the Union. So the first of the areas to be established as states would be long after the Articles of Confederation had been thrown out, Ohio in 1803. But very important, they put a ban on slavery. Ban on slavery of any of these territories, which is a significant moment. In fact, I believe if you were here yesterday, when we got to the stimulus question about the election of 1860, one of the answers was because of the Northwest Ordinance banning slavery. So if it's explicitly mentioned in the key concepts, you're going to want to make sure you know about it. And this map kind of shows you, here's the system. You don't need to memorize, the grid format or the 36 square miles, but understand that these are creating the conditions for states. I'm going to just kind of breeze by this one. This one's ratification of the Constitution. Different states had to do it. Remember, they had to get the Bill of Rights approved as a condition for especially areas that were skeptical. So you can kind of see that some areas were a lot less inclined to ratify the Constitution. I want to stop here for a minute because this one's often oversimplified and students get it wrong. If you look at this map, what do you see happening? Ignore the key concept for a minute. You see happening in here. We have a situation where it appears some states are slowly freeing or ending slavery. Those in the red, those states are going to be free states. And the ones in the blue, they're going to gradually end slavery. Usually it was by some rule, all future children born to enslaved people would be free, or at a certain age, you would get your freedom. There were different laws in different states. You don't need to be experts on this, but look at the key concept here. During and after the American Revolution, an increased awareness of inequalities in society motivated some individuals and groups to call for the abolition of slavery and greater political democracy in the new state and national governments. I'm going to ignore the part about democracy because we have some stuff that'll deal with that a little bit. But if you were writing an essay and the prompt, and I've seen this prompt a bunch of times, to what extent did the American Revolution fundamentally change politics or society in America? Like something about the impact of the American Revolution. You could by just knowing the key concept, write about how, as a result, partly as a result of the American Revolution, there began to be demands for the end of slavery. And since slavery was not especially profitable or as important to these areas, slavery is able to be banned in some of the former original colonies, as well in new territory that was established under the Articles of Confederation. Yeah, and to Tatiana's point, if you don't rely on enslaved people for your entire economic livelihood, like somewhere like South Carolina or a plantation in Virginia, then you're going to be okay with saying, yeah, if it ends, it ends. No big deal. And so part of it is from the rhetoric of the American Revolution, those Enlightenment ideas. The other part of it is just simple economics. It wasn't that important there. But what you see happening after the American Revolution, and you can see that in this map, is America very much dividing into two separate economic enterprises, free states and slave states. That might be important. In fact, going with that trend, take a look right here. Another key concept. Increasing Southern cotton production and the related growth of Northern manufacturing promoted the development of national and international commercial ties. Another thing that oftentimes gets overly simplified. This map shows you cotton production is expanding. I don't have to be too smart to see cotton, a lot of it. There's a reason it's called King Cotton, especially when you look at the Deep South. If you take a look, you can kind of see that in the Deep South, which happens to be the places that leave the Union the soonest or the quickest. But where's that cotton going? Well, in some cases, it's going to fuel the manufacturing that's taking place in northern states, the textile mills of New England area. It's going to places like England. And so these economies are different, but in some ways are connected as well. You could see that here with the increase of slavery. And I think Malik brought up a good point, with the cotton gin and the efficiency that it brought, slavery kind of is revitalized. And as a result of this, you have the expansion of slavery in the Deep South and adjacent Western lands, and rising anti-slavery sentiment begin to create distinctive regional attitudes towards slavery. If you look in this dark red, those are areas where 50% or more of the population were, in fact, bound into slavery. Once again, the Deep South. And you could see where slavery is taking a hold and how it's growing from 1790 to 1860. Cotton production, the cotton gin is a big part of that, but there's other parts of this story. Anyone remember who was in this particular region right here that was posing a particular problem in the 1820s and 1830s? Who's right here? Because, it's one thing to say we need more land to grow more cotton, and we need more slaves to allow for this cotton production to be as profitable as it could be. But you also need other things. And those other things is you need to get access to this land. Not just this land, but what about this land? What about this land? What about this land? And so another part of this story is this kind of, actually, let me just show you this really quickly. This is another question, another DBQ. This is one of the documents that was on it. Yeah, Ryan. Oh, I see you, Ryan. What were called the 5 civilized tribes, right? There's a reason they want to remove those native people, and they want to do it with such urgency and efficiency, and as they saw it. This is actually another DBQ. That's a document that was on the DBQ. And this one asks you, from 1775 to 1830, many African Americans gained freedom from slavery, yet during the same period, the institution of slavery expanded. So kind of what I just mentioned by showing you those maps. In some places, slavery was slowly fading away. In other areas, it was rapidly expanding. Explained by both of those changes took place. Analyze the ways that both free African Americans and enslaved African Americans responded to the challenges confronting them. Now, what ends up happening is oftentimes there's going to be questions within questions. I hate it. It's maddening. The questions are already hard enough. You don't need to put 2 questions in one and make it really confusing, but they do. So just be careful when you're answering this, that you address both parts. So they want you to explain, why is slavery slowly going away here and rapidly expanding here? And then what are the ways in which free African Americans and enslaved African Americans responded to the challenges confronting them? So let's see in the chat, what would you do with this document in terms of answering this prompt? And remember what I told you, if you happen to have an understanding of the key concepts, let me go back here really quickly. You could literally talk about, after the American Revolution, people began to be aware and economics led to the gradual abolition of slavery. You could talk about how cotton production, as a result of the cotton gin, allowed for slavery to become reinvigorated in the South, which led to its rapid increase. So that would help expand why one area had one thing, another had another. Just by looking at those maps and those key concepts, you can connect those dots. And you can make reference, as you can see in these maps, slavery's fading, slavery's growing. Samantha's point, the North wasn't ideal for farming. You had these Enlightenment ideas. And then for the second part, you can then talk about how enslaved African people, and I think we briefly mentioned this in one of our other sessions, how there was people running away, the existence of the Underground Railroad, there was all forms of work slowdowns, faking being sick, breaking tools, doing things to kind of undermine efficiency on the farm or plantation. So just by looking at these things, boom, 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 and then getting this document, you could start to write a really quality response to this prompt. Let me give you a few more. This is the second part of that question. What question am I talking about? Analyze the ways that both free African Americans and enslaved African Americans responded to the challenges confronting them. Think about the most obvious way you could respond: revolt. And one of the key concepts mentions anti-slavery efforts in the South were largely limited to unsuccessful slave rebellions. If you take a look at this map, there's not a whole lot of revolts that are, well, there's none that are successful. In fact, of the ones you see on the map, Nat Turner is really the one that leads to the killing of white Southerners. And that causes a great deal of fear in the minds of many Southerners. Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey, and you may or may not have learned about them, but hopefully you take a moment to kind of look back. They were two plots or conspiracies. Notice the language on the map. They were planning revolts. And in each instance, those revolts were ultimately discovered and prevented from occurring. So think about the system of control that took place to uphold slavery. There's a reason why it was illegal to read or write or to circulate anti-slavery literature, because that is a form of power and potential revolt. So you have the existence of revolts. And if you were answering the second part of this question, even though this map doesn't talk about slave revolts, you could easily say there was efforts by some enslaved African Americans to uproot the slave system through revolts. Nat Turner was the only successful one in terms of being executed, but ultimately it was also defeated along with others. So thinking about how you can use these examples, whether it's a map or a speech or a cartoon or a chart, how does this help you make a historically defensible point? And that's part of the scary thing you got to do on the exam, because it's all timed. I'm going to kind of burn through some of these because I want to save some time for some questions and come back to a point I made earlier. Yesterday, we looked at political parties. And one of the things that happens is 1800, Jefferson does win the election. Notice, though, if you get a map that has electoral results, oftentimes what students will fail to recognize is the regional nature of voting, especially when it comes to the 19th century. Oftentimes politics was dictated by which section they were. So the Federalists had a lot more power in the Northeast, whereas the Democratic Republicans tended to have more support in the West and the South. So kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at political parties, where their supporters were. And so this map is one example of that kind of taking a place. I'm going to skip. Transportation improvements. Remember, we have in the early 19th century, there is this plan to kind of get the economy growing. You have the formation of canals and roads and eventually rail that'll start to be built. This is going to cut down on transportation times. This one kind of is another one that was on a DBQ before. This one is, look at the key concept. The nation's transition to a more participatory democracy was achieved by expanding suffrage from a system based upon property ownership to one based on voting by all adult white men. And this was accompanied by growing political parties. If you look at something like this, you could see how the states are slowly allowing for universal white male suffrage. And it's very easy to be like, well, what about everyone else? And that's a question you should raise, but it does show a change. So if there was a question about to what extent was democratization successful at making America more representative, you can acknowledge that this was a dramatic change in the lives of men and white men in particular. Property requirements are going away, taxpayer qualifications are going away, but you can also acknowledge voting rights were not extended to women, African-American people, and there remained a lot of work to be done. Another kind of example of how these maps can show us this history. Following the Louisiana Purchase, the U.S. government sought influence and control over North America through a variety of means, including exploration and diplomatic efforts. Remember, one of the things that Thomas Jefferson does is send Lewis and Clark on the most epic road trip ever. And part of that is to, one, document what they just purchased for a very cheap price, given how big it was, but also to start making claims to this territory. Also, diplomatic efforts. Remember, you had the Adams-Onis Treaty, which eventually gives the United States control over Spanish Florida. You have all these different kind of moments. And with the Louisiana Purchase comes new challenges. We saw this one yesterday. Was it really an era of good feelings? If now you have to deal with admission of states or territories into states. And so notice what it says: congressional attempts at political compromise, such as the Missouri Compromise, only temporarily stem growing tensions between opponents and defenders of slavery. You draw a 3630 line, you say Missouri is going to be a slave state, Maine's going to be a free state. But what happens when you say bye-bye to the line with the KansasNebraska Act? That's going to create challenges. And don't worry about the geography, you all. My point in doing maps today is to kind of visualize the history that hopefully you've learned and to show you how a map could be used as evidence. You don't need to be an expert. If you were to give me a blank map of the United States, I'd probably be lost in terms of where everything goes. But can you connect these dots? Here's another idea. Remember that whole idea about cotton production, the growth of slavery? They want you to know the U.S. government sought influence and control over the Western Hemisphere through a variety of means, including military actions, American Indian removal. We've seen that the so-called 5 civilized tribes were forcibly removed, but even that story is not as simple. The Cherokee are the ones kind of most known because of the Trail of Tears. The Seminole Indians, though, of Florida fought back. There was a bloody, brutal war between the U.S. military and the Seminole people. A lot of people died, and eventually the Seminole Indians were defeated. And so just each of these tribes, all 5 of them, were eventually moved to what becomes Oklahoma. But knowing that history is another kind of element of your study. Think about just, the growth of people moving west along these different trails. And if you're really bored tonight, play the old school Oregon Trail game that I had to play as a kid. You got to type it up in the computer. You could find it. It's awesome. You'll get dysentery and die before you get to your destination. But the Oregon Trail was one of many overland trails. You had the Mormon Trek, which eventually arrived in the Salt Lake City, which, the Mormon people kind of established their religious refuge. So that's actually in the key concepts. The religious refuge that the Mormons established. You have the California Trail. You have Americans moving into Texas. And of course, that's going to lead to some problems. And kind of coming back to this story of immigration. You know, the map in 2014 looks very different than it did back in 1820 to 1860, which is what this map is looking at. Look at where immigrants are going. Anyone notice anything about where immigrants are going and where they're not going? Let's just say that this is a map on a multiple choice question. What could account for the fact that immigration appears to be lower in one part of the country than another? Give you a moment to kind of think about it. What's going on here with that in immigration? Let me ask you a more direct question. Where are the immigrants largely going? Forget who, where are they going? I'm seeing a lot of folks, yeah, in the northern states. The yellow is 20% or more of the population are immigrant. The green is 10 to 20%. Yeah, they're going either to the northern states or out in the west. Where are they not really going? The south, less than 10%. If this was a multiple choice question, they're not going to just ask you simple recall questions, but can you critically look at this? And I think I saw someone, oh, I see you, Evelyn. Yeah, they're going to places that there's jobs, industrial jobs, the textile industry, especially in the case of the Irish, or in the case of the Germans, out in the kind of Illinois, Ohio, because land is relatively cheap and maybe you can get started there. But yeah, they're mainly moving up into urban areas. And why not go to the South? Well, if the primary economic activity is agriculture and the primary labor force is enslaved people, it's kind of hard to compete economically with someone who is forced to work for free for life. So immigration, and as a result, this particular part of the country is not going to be as diverse, at least in the 19th century. Now, the South is changing today. There's constant people moving around everywhere. But for the most part, immigrants who, and then you look over here, the top immigrants are the Irish and the Germans in the 19th century. But you also have immigrants coming into places like California, the Chinese immigration, and other groups. It's 4:58. I want to give you time to, I could keep going. I have the entire history of the United States through maps. I went a little crazy here and just wanted to take you on a visual journey. But I want to pause to see if there's any questions I can kind of circle back to before we kind of close out for today. Poor Mexico took their land. That's going to create some problems. So I'll just kind of like ad lib as we're waiting in the chat for some questions. Going to have another compromise. Then you're going to have another compromise, KansasNebraska Act. And then just kind of looking at the history, trying to keep this balance between free and slave states. All the compromises. Oftentimes it's over extension of slavery into new territories. We saw yesterday what happens with the election of 1860. Southern states start leaving the Union. Obviously more. So to Tiff's question, are there many or a lot of maps on the multiple choice? I wouldn't say many. There's only 55 questions. And one of the things you're going to realize, and you're going to probably be grumpy because I'm always grumpy, is 55 questions is not a lot when you have questions in sets of 4 usually, or 3 to 4. And so there's a lot of topics you won't even get tested on. You won't even get tested on. Like there was a couple of years where there wasn't even a question about Andrew Jackson anywhere, and you might have spent 2 weeks on Andrew Jackson. So I would not anticipate a ton of maps, but I wanted you to kind of, one, review the content through maps, and also understand that critically reading them would be an important thing to keep in mind. So the North Ordinance helped the organization of states. Yeah, so Kate, I'm assuming you're talking about the Northwest Ordinances that definitely kind of established the precedent for states entering the Union as equal to the original 13. It set the guidelines for their entry, and also for the first time kind of restricted the institution of slavery in a particular region. Keep in mind, this was not terribly controversial because this area would not be areas that could be good for cash crop economy for the most part. All right, let me see here. So on, what would you leaving tips would you have us for some maps? In other words, I think in terms of the importance is, think about what you know that's not explicitly mentioned in the map. So for instance, you know, this map shows you slavery slowly ending in one part of the country and not in another. What information could you bring in, because you studied American history, that would be considered outside information that could help explain what's going on here? So for instance, the fact that during the American Revolution or after it, there's this kind of awareness that of these Enlightenment principles, and that there becomes a slow and small anti-slavery movement in some places. The Quakers were a big part of that. You know, so thinking about the maps in terms of what it shows, and then what the history that you know can elaborate and bring more light to those particular areas. I think one person in the chat even like this, right? This shows the growth of cotton production. It doesn't say that the cotton gin was invented, or it doesn't say that the textile industry there was an industrial revolution. So what would you be able to do to bring in that information? That's kind of what you want to do, especially if it's a DBQ or something like this, where, you know, just describing the map is not what you want to do. It's about tying it to the content. Great question about Dred Scott. The reason why this wouldn't count, or I would not bring that up, is look at the prompt. It says to 1830. And Dred Scott does not happen until 1856, if I'm correct. I'm just guessing in my head. But so, yeah, you want to pay attention to the dates, because Dred Scott would not be something that would be relevant to this prompt, because the prompt is asking you to keep it from 1775 to 1830. Great questions, you all. Thank you for the participation in the chat. We're going to be doing these again, so I hope to see you and in the future. And that'll be it for me today.
All right, well, we will wrap things up. I don't know if you can see me yet or not, but please be sure and ask questions. Please be sure and send those questions in, because that's what he wants to do, is answer your questions. We've enjoyed your chat tonight. You guys were very active. Good job with the participation. I want to direct you to the Bill of Rights Institute's website and just remind you that they have a resource library of over 4,000 items, 650 different lessons, 300 essays for you to read, and more than 300 videos for you to watch. And they're not long videos. They're short and to the point, so you can get some good stuff. Also, Think the Vote, where you can discuss and debate current events and learn about those things that are currently going on around you. So just a great resource for you to explore and encourage your teachers to explore. We'll see you again next Monday night, same time, same place, Monday afternoon for those of you on the West Coast.